Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center and to today's convening of America's Town Hall. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, and let's begin, as we always do, by inspiring ourselves for the learning ahead by reciting together the National Constitution Center's meaningful congressional mission. Here we go. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. Wonderful. Before we start, I want to plug a series of great programs that are coming up. Next Friday on April 9th, our Friday class will be joined by Jill Lepore, the great Harvard historian and New Yorker writer, who will spread much constitutional light. And the following Friday, we're joined by Akhil Amar of Yale Law School. These Friday classes are pegged for high school and college students, but adult learners from around the country are tuning in and learning from all the great constitutional light. On April 29th, we have a really meaningful panel, Do We Need a Third Reconstruction? With Sherilyn Ifill from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Wilfred Coddington of Brooklyn, William Allen, and Kurt Lash. A new program on May 12th, The Ways that American Literature Has Intersected with the Constitution. Bernadette Myler from Stanford and Allison LaCroix of the University of Chicago and Stephen Cushman from Virginia. What an exciting topic that will be. And then on June 15th, Free Speech, the Media, Truth and Lies with Martha Minow from Harvard Law School and Jonathan Rauch discussing their new books along with Paul Matsko from the Cato Institution. Tune in and let us reason together. We'll be taking your questions throughout the show today, so please put them in the Q&A box and I will introduce them as best I can. And I want to thank the generous support of the McNulty Foundation in partnership with the Anne Welsh McNulty Institute for Women's Leadership at Villanova University, which helped make this program possible. The program is also part of the center's Women and the Constitution initiative, which you can learn more about on our website. And now it is a great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Thavolia Glymph is a historian and professor of history and law at Duke University. She is the author, most recently, of The Women's Fight, the Civil War's Battle for Home, Freedom, and Nation, which was a finalist for the 2021 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. She's also the author of other important books, including Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household. She served as a scholarly advisor to the National Constitution Center's so inspiring theatrical performance 14, which reads original text from the 14th Amendment and also helped advise our Civil War and 19th Amendment exhibits. And Dorothy Wickenden is executive editor of The New Yorker, and she moderates the magazine's weekly podcast, The Political Scene. She is the author, most recently, of The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. And it is such an honor to welcome Thavolia Glymph and Dorothy Wickenden. Dorothy, I want to begin with you to congratulate you. The New York Times just posted today its review of your new book, The Agitators, which it rightly called a masterpiece. And you tell so vividly the story of three women who have not been attended to before you discovered their friendship. Martha Wright, Frances Seward, and Harriet Tubman. Tell us why you chose to write about these three women and who they were.
Thank you, Jeff. What a great introduction and what a roster of coming events. I can't wait to tune in. So my three protagonists, Frances Seward, got married at the age of 19. She was an aristocratic young woman, born and grew up in the town of Auburn, New York. And she came to women's rights and abolition through experiences that she had herself. And she had to kind of break away from the very traditional upbringing she had had, which she did with the help of these two women who became incredibly influential in her life. So the second, Martha Coffin Wright, happened to live around the corner. Auburn was a very conservative conservative industrial town, peopled by lawyers and bankers and entrepreneurs. And they immediately discovered that they were the two outliers in town. Martha was a Quaker by birth and very much by sensibility. She was just absolutely anti-slavery. And her older sister, who was 14 years older, was Lucretia Mott, who was a world-renowned human rights advocate and reviled, I might add. So she was younger. Martha, so much younger, was very much influenced by her older sister, who was quite formidable. But Martha herself was a rebel from birth. That was just, she just didn't like the strictures that were put upon women in the 19th century. They were supposed to keep to their separate sphere, which meant the kitchen, basically, where they cooked, cleaned, and they took care of their children and took care of their husbands. And she thought that was ridiculous. And again, influenced by her older sister, Lucretia. So in 1849, everyone has heard of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman liberated herself from slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. She walked alone out of slavery to Philadelphia, a distance of about 100 miles. And she got there, she found herself a place to live and a job, and quickly got to know all of the abolitionists in town, one of whom was Lucretia Mott. And she became very close to Lucretia Mott. And eventually Lucretia introduced her to Martha, and Martha introduced her to Frances. And that was the beginning of this collaboration and what became a really intimate friendship among the three for the rest of their lives.
Thank you so much for that riveting account of their meeting and their friendship. And I can't wait to ask you more about each of them. Thavolia Glymph, your book is path-breaking because it emphasizes the fissures among white and Black women, including those in the North and the South. Tell us about those divisions of race and class, which others have focused on with less precision and specificity, and broadly help us understand, was the improbable friendship that Dorothy Wickenden described so memorably unusual in uniting these white women with Harriet Tubman, or were there similar friendships throughout the war?
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you, Dorothy, for this extraordinary book. I learned a lot, and so what I would say, Jeff, in response is that, so one of the things that I was interested in is thinking about women across the boundaries of race and class, and thinking about Northern white women who became abolitionists, particularly those who went south during the Civil War. And so what really sort of caught my attention with Dorothy's book is that Dorothy does not neglect the fissures. She doesn't neglect the dissonance. We see it in her book when there is a fierce debate about who should get the right to vote first, right? Whether or not women should get it at the same time as Black men and so forth. We see it in her sort of reminding us of how racist Stanton could be, right? And reminding us of how Black women, abolitionists, really fought hard and began fighting hard for abolition and organizing prior to white women organizing. And so one of the things I appreciated about Dorothy's book, among many, many that we'll be able to talk about, is that she takes us on this journey, and this journey is not all unfamiliar, but the way in which she does it makes it seem new and compelling, because we have these three women, two white women and one Black woman. The Black woman we know a good deal about, but we haven't really thought of her in this context in terms of her relationship with white women abolitionists in this particular way. And so I found that really compelling. And I found that the entire book it's like breathtaking, because even when, as I said, even when the material is not new to me, the way in which it is put together makes it new and fresh and compelling. And a lot of it was new. I didn't know about Frances as much as I learned about Frances, which is really fascinating, and Frances Wright. So that would be my response to that, Jeff.
Wonderful. Well, exploring both what was unique and what was unusual about the friendship will be something that I'm so eager to explore more. Dorothy, there's so many places to start, but one thing that struck me, of course, is that Martha Coffin Wright is related to Lucretia Mott. The Glymph sisters are related as well. To what degree? I want to know where the passion for abolition and women's rights came from. So starting with Martha and Lucretia, was it in the family? Was it from their reading? What was it about the family, about that particular family that produced these extraordinary women?
About the Wright family, Martha Coffin Wright. Well, she came from a long line of Quakers, and Quakers, as you know, especially Hicksite Quakers, which is the more radical branch, were extremely anti-slavery. They were among the first in America to free they did own slaves, and they were among the first to recognize they thought it was a cause. And so Martha grew up surrounded by brothers and sisters and a very strong mother who believed that women were absolutely men's equal. There was just no question about it. And of course, in Quaker meeting, women were allowed to speak, which they weren't otherwise allowed to do at large. So she grew up among, in this very radical family, and they moved to Philadelphia when she was just still a little girl. But the circles they traveled in were very small because they were not welcomed among what would be called polite society, because they socialized with Black Americans, and that was just considered completely unacceptable. So this was who Martha was, and she happened to have this extremely forceful and sardonic personality. And so when she allowed herself, finally, it took her a while to find her voice, but when she did, initially, she just let her aggravations out in her letters to Lucretia. She just hated being a stay-at-home housewife. She hated just because she had 6 children, taking care of them, all day, every day, and then having to answer to her husband's demands at the end of the day. And she worked until 11 or midnight. Her husband had long since gone to bed. So all of this was brewing in her. And then in 1848, Lucretia Mott was in upstate New York, and they were invited to a small gathering of friends in nearby Waterloo. And there, it was 1848, July, and it was 5 women, and young Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there. And these women started talking about how much they hated their lives and how unjust the laws that privileged white men had created for Americans, how unjust they were, and they talked about doing something about it. Lucretia Mott had been an activist in anti-slavery circles for a very long time at that point, but there had never been a national women's rights convention. So they organized the Seneca Falls Convention, which took place 10 days later, and one of the first people they invited was Frederick Douglass, who had started his newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester. And he himself was only 10 years out of slavery, but was already a world-renowned and reviled abolitionist. So at that convention, Martha immediately befriended Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass, and that was the beginning of her kind of entry into radical politics.
Wow, how important to signify that year, 1848, as a turning point, and the importance of Seneca Falls. Thavolia, you begin your book by quoting from a group of Maryland women in 1861 who were addressing Winifred Scott and calling on white men to remember women's natural rights and hear their agonizing cries for the protection God has entrusted to man on our behalf. They're invoking the language of natural rights and the Declaration of Independence, of course, to defend the slaveholding system and their own privilege as white women. And I guess my question to you is, Seneca Falls invoked the Declaration on behalf of women's equal rights. All men and women are created equal. To what degree was ideology an important unifying factor in defining women's approach to abolition? And to what degree, and the Declaration in particular, and to what degree was that just trumped by racial and class divisions?
When you say ideology, you mean which ideology?
I guess I mean
generally.
Yeah, the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration, which is invoked by both sides to either defend slavery or to oppose it.
Well, I think that the women in Baltimore, who I begin the book with, are invoking a privilege that only white women have. When they speak of natural rights, they are invoking this idea that women should be protected, that white women are nurturers, that their homes should be protected and defended. And the women in Dorothy's book are speaking of a different world. They're trying to bring in a different world where women recognize that home is not this space where everything is beautiful and lovely, that women are not content to just let their men go out into the world. There was this part in the book that really struck me. I can't remember, Dorothy, you can remind me, where one of the women is writing to maybe her sister or someone. She said, maybe men should think about coming home and taking care of women. Instead of, we have this notion that when men come home, women should be ready to feed them and bathe them and take care of them. And, it just reminded me again that at the same time that you had probably the vast majority of American women opposing women in the public and women abolitionists and women trying to get the right to vote, there was this small army of women like Frances Wright who, made her way forward, who were saying, no, we deserve to be educated. We deserve to have the right to own property. We deserve to even have the right to vote. And so this small army of women that Dorothy is providing for us, and others have too, are really speaking to a different ideology and a different narrative. But they are, like abolitionists in general, they constitute a minority of the American population, and even of Northern Americans. Most Northern women are not abolitionists. Most Northern women are not feminists. Most Northern women are not out there trying to get the vote. And so some of she reminds us of some of the really horrible language that was used to try to defeat these women who were fighting for abolition and also fighting for women's rights. So I think that, I juxtapose those women in Baltimore who are calling on men to remember the battles in the past and to remember that the men who are fighting against each other now really should not be enemies. And, I juxtapose them to, a group of women, Black women in Baltimore on a street corner who are saying, we cannot wait until March 4th, 1861, when Lincoln is inaugurated. Things will change. And so these are the women like Harriet Tubman who are desperate for change and who are going to fight for change. And so those are the two sort of conflicting ideologies that are sort of going on. And most men side with the women who want things to remain the same. At least they say they do.
Thank you for that. It is an amazing juxtaposition with those Black women looking forward to Lincoln's inauguration day. And synchronistically today, just today, the state of Maryland decided to repeal its state song, which referred to Abraham Lincoln as a despot and Union soldiers as Northern scum. It's astonishing that mentality prevailed until just today. Dorothy, tell us more about Frances Seward, married to the New York senator, governor, and future Secretary of State. What was the source of her commitment to women's suffrage and abolition, and how did it change over the course of the war?
Yes, so it began quite early, especially given the upbringing she had had. And her sister, her older sister, lived in Auburn as well. And they both married young. And Frances would often go over to their house and visit with them. She was there one evening, and she wrote to her husband, William H. Seward, that she said, Henry, she called him Henry, such a scene as I have been witness to, you simply could not believe. And it turned out that her sister Lizette's husband was beating her up regularly. And he threatened to, Frances that day was reading a book in an armchair, and he seized the book from her hand and he threw it across the room, and he ordered her out of the house. And Lizette was weeping. He had grabbed their child. It was just a horrific scene. And so Frances was extremely well educated, especially for a woman of that age. She had read Mary Wollstonecraft. She had read John Stuart Mill. She knew about all of this in the abstract, and she knew that women were appallingly treated often by men. But to witness her own sister be helpless before, she called him the brute she married, was just revelatory to her. So that was her awakening to women's rights. And then 4 years later, she and her husband, her health wasn't very good, and the doctor recommended that they take a long summer trip together, which they did, and they decided to go south. And Frances had always been opposed to slavery, but on their trip in Virginia, which was the biggest slaveholding state, there were two experiences. One where they stopped at a farm, and an elderly woman was working at some farm machine. And Frances went over to speak to her, and she turned out to be blind. And Frances, in her usual polite way, asked her about her family and her children. And she said, my husband and my children were all sold, and I've never seen them since. And Frances said, well, how do you put up with such sorrow? And the woman said, well, this is just what God has given us, and we have to accept it. So that was just one scene. There was another, and she came home from that trip, and they went to Washington, where slavery was legal and where enslaved people were bought and sold on the National Mall. And she came home, and she had been transformed into, she was already going down that road, but she was now a radical abolitionist.
Extraordinary, the importance of that encounter with domestic violence, and also her deep reading of Mary Wollstonecraft, and so striking that as her daughter is preserving her correspondence at the end of her life, after she's died, you note, she refers to Frances's penetrating readings of Jefferson, Dickens, Martineau, and many other public intellectuals they've known over the years. And Henry says she loved knowledge because it disclosed the treasures of truth.
Yes, I love that line.
It was really moving. And would love to, and it must have been very moving to read those letters as well, with the account of those authors. Thavolia, your book has been called pathbreaking for perhaps more than any work in recent memory, writes Misty Harper. You thoughtfully analyze how the Confederate project allowed poor white women access to vaunted white womanhood. You reveal that poor white women often resented the Confederacy as an institution that called on impoverished white people to sacrifice the most for the failing war effort. And you chronicle vicious classism, elite white women growing indignant at the poor corn women demanding welfare from the Confederacy, and also the paternalism that distorted some of the white women abolitionists who had a rather protective attitude toward enslaved people. So tell us about those jarring but important classist tensions.
Sure, thank you. So I think we historians have written quite a bit about class conflict, right, in the South during the Civil War, about the yeoman farmers and the poor white farmers and the poor white women who, struck for bread because they were hungry and whose husbands were gone and they were, their families were starving. And I wanted to move that conversation beyond just thinking about these women as, going to the market in Richmond and demanding bread, but I wanted to think of them really in a more human and humane way, about their everyday lives and how difficult it was for them. For now, they see so clearly that poor white people in the South are even more looked down upon than they thought they were. They are dealing with the brutal hatred of rich white people during the war. And in turn, poor white people demonstrate their contempt for slaveholders. And I wanted to put that, really out there in a different kind of way, to show that they're just not sitting back thinking, okay, we're going to support this a project to build a new modern slave nation, and not resist it, because we really don't have an interest in this project, a political interest or a financial interest. And so that was my goal there. And when I read Dorothy's book, it reminded me, and Dorothy talks about, and Frances in particular, who came from a well-to-do a family who had servants, right, Dorothy?
Yes.
And so, I thought about, like, who were these women in her household, and what was her relationship to these women in her household who cooked for her and cleaned for her and made other women jealous of her who didn't have these things. And so in my book, I try to think about what a difference it made if you were a woman abolitionist and you did have servants. You could travel because you had someone to take care of the kids or to cook and clean for you. And how it made abolition a kind of a class project. So how many poor white Northern women are abolitionists was kind of in the back of my mind when I was doing this work, my own work. And it was in the back of my mind too, as I read Dorothy's book, which made it, sort of brought it to the forefront again, that to do this kind of work, whether you're Black or white abolitionist, you had to have, or you needed resources. Harriet Tubman is an exception, right? I mean, she's an exception in all kinds of ways. She doesn't really care about money. She just has this, she's just compelled to do the work she knows has to be done. She lives from, day to day often without money, and her abolitionist friends do help her out to get a home in Auburn and so forth. But most abolitionist women are not Harriet Tubmans, right? Except the only ones I would say are Harriet Tubmans would be the enslaved women who are abolitionists, but tend not to be called abolitionists. And they don't have resources. They have no one to take care of their dishes or their clothing, but they're abolitionists. But in terms of women who are not enslaved, it took some resources to do this kind of work, which is not to denigrate that it took resources, but to admit the fact that it did.
And if I could, Jeff, just add one thing to that, because that's so interesting and true. And you mentioned, and it is absolutely right that Frances grew up, she was a very spoiled girl, and she felt guilty about that. She really did. And
she did.
And her father had hired the original servants in the house, and two of them were a married couple. They had once been enslaved, and they now worked for Judge Miller first, and then for the Sewards. And Frances had a very close relationship to this woman who was also named Harriet, and they were active. This couple was very active on the Underground Railroad in Auburn. So that was how Frances would hear these stories and learn about how the Underground Railroad worked. And so Harriet Tubman was probably the most immediate provided the immediate impetus to open her old basement kitchen to fugitive slaves. But she had former slaves working in her household, and she had no interest in dressing well. She hated attending her husband's fancy parties in Washington. And so it was kind of a liberal guilt complex at work there. And this really motivated her to do something beyond her own selfish, to see to something beyond her own selfish needs.
Yeah, I found her, Frances, really interesting because, as you say, she was born into this wealth, and she hated, from reading your book, she hated the parties in Washington. She hated the women who fussed over their appearance. She hated the attention that women thought they needed from men. She hated that they weren't paying more attention to their intellect. And she did have this couple that you mentioned who had been hired by her father, and then she hired them later, living with her. And they, this Black couple that worked for her were themselves agents, right, on the Underground Railroad. So there's this really powerful story just in that little tidbit of this white woman abolitionist who employs this couple who are also abolitionists, and they are working the Underground Railroad. And so you get to see in that part of the book, and as well as elsewhere, the kind of integration that's taken place, the way in which Jeff pointed this out at the beginning, which none of these women are operating in a vacuum, right? And so it takes, to work the Underground Railroad and to be an abolitionist takes courage, first of all, and political awareness. And it takes knowing that you can rely on and trust people. And Tubman, as you and others have pointed out, found out how important that could be, that you really, really did have to trust.
Yes, and it was the Underground Railroad, which operated with incredible success, very few betrayals for almost 50 years, really depended, as you say, on this absolute trust. It was this very, even though they were spread out across the country, including into the Deep South, members of the Underground Railroad, they depended on all these contacts along the way. And it was this wonderful kind of experiment in democracy, where it was actually a real democracy, because you had white men and Black men, enslaved people and free Blacks, and upper class women like Frances Seward, and middle class women like Martha Coffin Wright. And somehow it all worked. There was no real hierarchy there. Everyone had to work together and believe in each other to make it succeed. And it really did. And Tubman had a very keen sense of whom she could trust. This was developed, from birth, of necessity. And she could see immediately that Lucretia Mott and Martha and Frances were people who shared her fundamental beliefs about human freedom.
If I could just say one other thing, Jeff, that I think is really important about this book, Dorothy's book, is that we encounter these women in women's spaces, right? What we sometimes around kitchen tables, and we encounter them in relationship to big questions, big political questions that are agitating the country. One of the more sort of interesting moments in the book is when you talk about the Compromise of 1850. And I don't remember the exact words that you use, but you talk about how that really galvanized Harriet Tubman, for example, to begin to make her trips back to Maryland to get her husband, who of course did come, and her other family members. And so, and not only does Harriet come in there, but you sort of open the book up to the wider world, right? The politics of it all. So these women appear not simply to be working on their little projects, but they're part of a larger project to stop the expansion of slavery, to defeat this notion that the United States should be an empire of slavery, to help women see the ways in which they have been discriminated against, and to see how paths that they can get out of the situation, even though most are not willing to take that road at that particular moment. So I really appreciated the big picture, always tying into the kitchen table. And not everyone can do this well, and not lose, the reader doesn't lose sight of the small family pains, right? The loss of a child, we can actually see Tubman walking 300 miles. We can see how hard it was to not be able to save a child who had tuberculosis. And so those intimate moments, family moments, joined with the moments where women are coming together in larger groups, and that joins with the bigger political story. And I appreciated that. And one of the things I wanted, if I could, Jeff, to have you talk a little bit about is, you take us from the first women's convention to the 11th. I think the 11th was in 1866. And so over that period of time, how do you see women, white women, like changing, making progress? How do the issues that they're addressing in what's the first one, 1830?
Well, 1833 was the American Anti-Slavery Society, when women weren't allowed to join, and then women were just beginning to form their own anti-slavery societies, and many of which were integrated by race. So,
well, I think I'm thinking of the one in 1837, the
yes.
national, the Women's National Anti-Convention, and so from 1837 to 1866, right? 3 decades. How do you see them sort of changing in terms of what they wanted and how they're going about trying to get it?
Well, there a great deal happened in those years, of course, including the Civil War. So it's hard to summarize. But one thing, when you mentioned that meeting in 1866, that I'd love to focus on, because I think it shows how much Martha has changed and how far the women's rights movement has become. So during the Civil War, women suspended their activities on behalf of women and went all in for abolition, including launching a massive campaign, the biggest petition campaign ever on either side of the Atlantic, to pass the 13th Amendment. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martha Coffin Wright, and Susan B. Anthony were at the forefront of that movement. But in 1860, you mentioned the convention, the 11th convention in 1866. So the war is over, and the women's rights advocates decide, okay, we can now have a convention again, and they do in New York. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Martha all hope it's going to be an occasion to bring everyone together, abolitionists, Black women, Black and white men, and make, again, sort of think about human rights, broadly speaking. But at that point, it was the 14th Amendment was beginning to be discussed in Congress. The tensions that had always been present among abolitionists, and certainly within the women's rights movement, suddenly became clearer. So Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a 41-year-old Black poet, activist, women's rights activist, abolitionist, spoke after Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Stanton was, this was going to be her great moment. In fact, to me, the stellar speech at that convention was by this amazing Black woman who said, "You white women speak of rights. I want to tell you about wrongs." And she gave this stunning speech. As it happened, Harriet Tubman had just returned from the war, and she, on the train from Philadelphia to New York, the conductor came into the passenger car and told her to get out. She had to move back to the smoking car. And Tubman, and this is 100 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. And Harriet Tubman said, I will not do that. She served in the Civil War for 3 years. She said, I've served my country. This is where I belong. I've got my ticket, and that's it. And she grabbed the seat and she wouldn't let go. So the conductor had to call 2 other men. She was incredibly strong, even though she was tiny, to wrench her out of her seat, broke her wrist, threw her into the smoking car. Ellen Watkins Harper knew about this incident, and she talked about it at this convention. And she said, that is a disgrace to our country. And she said, the same thing just happened to me on the train, and we will not stand for this. So it was suddenly she had completely stolen the show. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was, sort of put in the background, and this incredibly forceful Black woman was saying, you know what, we have something to say here too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that story is really important. Tubman, this woman who's given so much to her country, not being able to ride the cars that white women ride. And of course, this was the story that so many Black women were telling before the war and during the war and after the war, and certainly was the kind of experience that inspired Black men who became politicians during Reconstruction to push for changes and public accommodations to make them equal for all people. So yeah, that's a great story. I mean, I love Frances Harper, and it reminded me too, I was just thinking as you were speaking of the wonderful work, recent work of Martha Jones, Vanguard, who's also reminding us that, these Black women were, really out there in the vanguard, pushing for change in the way they were treated in the public spaces and in private spaces. So your book and telling that story again is a great reminder of how poorly Tubman was treated, and how, despite her accomplishments, and how other Black women stood up for her, like Harper, and said, no, we have something to say here. Our experience is quite different from white women's experience. And so I don't know how you did all of this so to bring so many stories together. I mean, I love stories, to tell stories, but it takes a special knack to bring them together in a coherent way when they're coming from so many different places. So thank you.
A lot of trial and error, and many years.
Hearing you in conversation with each other is riveting, and it would be wonderful you'd continue, but I'm so glad that Thavolia focused us on that 1866 convention, because as you've both been describing, that was really the beginning of the fissures in the movement among African-American men and white women, and between African-American women and white women, and also among those groups. So Dorothy, why don't you tell the story of those fissures where the Stanton and Anthony come together with the American Equal Rights Association, claiming that the rights of Black people and women had the same civil and political status, but then the whole thing really fractured. Why did that happen, and what happened?
It was really a terrible moment, and it brought out the absolute worst in Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and it happened soon after that convention. So that convention, which they hoped would bring everyone together, in fact, was the beginning of this schism. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had felt very strongly that during the war, when they had suspended their conventions, that they were fighting with everything they had on this massive petition campaign, which was very successful, to get the 13th Amendment passed, with the understanding that when the war was over, all of their abolitionist friends, they all worked quite closely together up until that point, that they would do the same for women. And they somehow were unable to accept the fact that after the war, there were Black men and Black women who had been technically freed from slavery were not actually freed from slavery, and Black men in the South were being lynched. They desperately needed the vote, desperately. And as Ellen Harper said, as much as white women need this, Black women and Black men need it more. So that was the kernel of this big debate. And they simply, so as the 14th Amendment was being debated, they kept they focused on getting women suffrage for women. And when that didn't happen, and then the 15th Amendment was underway, they objected to the 15th Amendment because it did not include it. In the 14th Amendment had added the word male to the Constitution for the first time, which was an outrage. And then for the 15th Amendment, they said, well, if it's not going to include the right for women to vote, then we oppose it. And I think it was Stanton who said, I object, I object, I object. And worse than that, they became all out racists. So they accepted funding from this crazy man who was like an early Donald Trump to start their own newspaper. And it became this racist rag. And they kept saying over and over again that white women deserved the vote more than Black men. And this was really caused Frederick Douglass, who had been their close ally through all those years, he really let them have it on that. And so they broke apart, started their own women's organization, and Lucy Stone started another one because she wanted to advocate for the 15th Amendment. And it took many years, and it was beyond the scope of my book. I only deal with that in the epilogue, but took many, many years for those groups to come together again. And in the very end, in 1888, when Stanton and Anthony were starting yet another women's organization, an international group, they invited Douglass to speak, and he just gave this incredible tribute to these women who had been so dreadful. And he said, what we did in achieving emancipation was to be commended, but what it took for women to achieve their rights was even more remarkable.
That was an incredible speech, and it was. Forgive me, I'm so eager for your reaction to Thavolia, but I think it was one of the last speeches of Douglass's life, and that tribute it was in his obituary, and that tribute is so striking. He's saying it was even braver for women to stand up for their own rights.
I know. I still can't quite get over it, and it just shows his just how he was able to rise above this kind of internal pettiness. And by the way, so was Tubman. It was really remarkable to see that she, unlike Martha, who was completely tormented, caught between her friend Frederick Douglass and her support for what he stood for, she did not agree with Stanton and Anthony, but her very close friendship with those two women. So the fact that Douglass was able to put that aside, and that Harriet Tubman was able to put aside that extraordinary nastiness and go and speak before Anthony and Stanton's group was just remarkable.
Thavolia, was this fissure, as they say, overdetermined? I mean, your entire book is about the fissures, the class and race fissures among women and men and so forth. So were you surprised, as they say, or in other words, did this have to do with the personalities of Katie Stanton, or would it have happened even if there had been less racist white women in charge at that time?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with Katie Stanton. I mean, from all we know, she was like really racist to the bone. She didn't think that Black men or Asian men, she talked about them too, were as qualified to vote or qualified at all to vote as she was, or women like her. And perhaps if the movement had a different leader, it might have had a different kind of result or impact at that moment. And when you were talking about Douglass, Douglass has so much integrity, so he can go back to them and say, I am still for women getting the right to vote, after he had said a pretty point blank to Stanton, And you, Dorothy, this is a famous quote from Douglass, where in response to in response to Stanton and Anthony's starting this paper, The Revolution, Douglass said, when women, because they are women, are hunted down through the streets of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their homes and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are the objects of insult and outrage at every turn, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. So that's, I think, in 69 about, and he can come back because for him, the question of whether or not women deserve the vote has not changed. What he got really upset about was the Stanton pretending as if the problems that she faced or white women faced were of the same magnitude, the same order as the problems that enslaved people faced or even free white people. So he comes through here in this book again as this man who was for human rights, period, right? And so we can't say enough about Douglass. Well, David Blight has said a lot about him, so we have him to thank. But so I really, again, appreciated the sort of not forgetting or not letting lay to the side these interventions on the part of Black people in this discussion, which really made the discussion, the book, just that much richer. Because sometimes when you work in an archive, you decide what to leave behind, right? And what to include. And you could have written a book about 3 women and their interactions, their views about life and love and marriage and politics without the messiness, but you didn't neglect the messiness. And so that to me is really important.
We have just 5 minutes left, time for one intervention each. I know time is flying by, but hearing each of you in conversation with each other is just so memorable and moving. I think I'd like each of you to ask the other a final question because I know you have lots to ask each other. So Dorothy, what would you like to ask Thavolia?
I am really curious about what you're working on next. Where has your work taken you? If you don't mind talking about it.
No, I don't. It's people who know me will know I've been working for too many years to count on a book on Black women refugees during the Civil War. That's now become a book about Black women refugees going back to the American Revolution. But that's been my pet project for several years. So I'm turning now to that project, and I'm about finished with another project, which is a history of Confederate officers who joined the Egyptian army during Reconstruction and their experience in Egypt. So it's about race and sort of imagining the South in a different space as these men who are now broke and poor and, take off their Confederate uniforms and put on Egyptian uniforms. And there's some Northern officers with them too, but I'm more focused on the Southern officers. So that's what I'm trying to finish up now.
It sounds fascinating.
I'm so glad you asked, and I know we all can't wait to read that, Thavolia. What an amazing topic. Thavolia, what is your final question to Dorothy? And we'll give Dorothy the last word.
So Dorothy, again, thank you for this amazing book. And I'll ask you the same question. You've written 3 books now. When I got the invitation to do this project on your book, I thought I need to read everything she's written. And so I have. And now I want to know what you're up to next.
Oh, I was afraid as soon as I asked that question, I knew this was coming. So I'm going to, this is a total cop out, but I'm still sort of working through this book. I'm on my book tour now. I do have some sort of half-formed thoughts in the back of my mind, but I'm not sort of ready yet, and I haven't researched them. So I think I just have to end on that whingy.
That's fine. That's fine.
Well, we do have enough time to then, Dorothy, for you to leave our rapt audience with the final thoughts you'd like them to think about as they contemplate the incredibly important topic of your new book, The Agitators.
Yes, this is something I thought about. This book took me 7 years to write. The country has gone through a number of very dramatic periods as I was writing it. It was Barack Obama was president, and when I started it, I was full of hope about where the country was going. Then it looked as though we were going to have our first woman as president. That did not happen. And most recently, watching in recent years, watching where the country is going has been so disturbing to me because it is so reminiscent of the 1850s. And on January 6th, with the attack on the United States Capitol and seeing white supremacists enter the Capitol of the United States carrying Confederate flags, I thought it actually, we could be entering an era that is as dangerous and divisive as that era was. And it was incredibly disturbing. And so what I hope people will take from this book is that these three women who at the time seemed completely ordinary, each in her own way, how could they possibly imagine that they could bring on the Second American Revolution? It just seemed completely impossible. And yet they were utterly dedicated it was not long after the Declaration of Independence had been signed, and they were committed to the words in that document, and they saw the flaws in the Constitution, and they were determined to change that, and they did. And so some of the grassroots movements we are seeing today are really an outgrowth of what those women and all of their friends were doing. So Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and the work that Stacey Abrams has been doing in Georgia, all of this is really important in a democracy. And John Lewis, the great John Lewis, wrote a piece right before he died, and he said, democracy is not a state, it is an act. And when ordinary people do extraordinary things, they recreate the vision of what America has to be.
Thank you so much, Dorothy Wickenden and Thavolia Glymph, for a riveting, memorable discussion of the women's fight, of the Civil War battles for home, freedom, and nation, and the agitators, three friends who fought for abolition and women's rights. Thanks to the McNulty Foundation and the Anne Welsh McNulty Institute for Women's Leadership at Villanova. And thank you, friends, for taking an hour this evening to educate yourself about history, the Constitution, and women's rights. Thanks to all, and hope to see you soon.